come for this panel, but Professor Inaba, who's here from Nagoya, is going to do double duty on this panel, just as John Maurer did on the first panel. And because over the last month or 6 weeks I've been talking with Professor Inaba about not the mediation that he's going to do on the diplomacy of Portsmouth, but on a subject, a new subject that he's been working on for some time, which is the building of submarines for the Japanese in 1903, 1904, here at the Fall River shipyard, Quincy, Massachusetts. And 5 submarines were disassembled and brought to Japan in 1904. At that time, we saw one picture, I think, in Dr. Kazura's slideshow about a Russian submarine. So submarines were starting to appear at that time. But we're going to be learning about this just new research from Professor Inaba. So I just wanted to announce that change before we get started. And our moderator today, and she'll introduce the panelists, is Dr. Amy Janelle. And she's a great expert on the Ottomans, and which may surprise you. Why is Amy here? But because the Russo-Japanese War had a great impact on Ottoman thinking. And so she'll make a comment on that after the panelists, and we'll go on to the questions and answers. So we see here who our panelists are. Dr. Inaba from, as I mentioned, from Nagoya in Japan. Bill Tilchin, who's the secretary and the editor of the Teddy Roosevelt Journal, the Theodore Roosevelt Association, and then attorney Charles Doliak, who is the president of the New Hampshire Japan Society. And happy to have all of you here today. So thank you very much. Take it away.
Thank you so much. We're going to start our second panel of the day. I'd like to introduce Professor Inaba, who's Professor of International Relations and at the Faculty of Urban Science at Beidou University. Welcome.
Yes, thanks a lot for inviting me to this excellent conference. Yes, when I come to Boston, I have to think about anything topic concerning Boston, I should speak. So I find this topic. So the first U.S.-Japanese naval cooperation started in Boston during the Russo-Japanese War. I'm researching for a long time about Japanese submarines, how Japanese Navy introduced the submarines. And I was very much interested in the also Russian submarines, how Russians introduced the submarines. Okay, so it's submarine was the latest weapon in World War I, but not World War I. It's during the Russo-Japanese War time, already submarine was developed. And Russia and Japan deployed submarine in the far eastern waters, but neither of them is in active service at all, because at that time submarines cannot cruise in the Pacific Ocean. There's a very high waves. It cannot cruise at all. Only they can cruise in the Tokyo Bay. But both navies paid great attention to shadows of the enemy's submarines and also prepared anti-submarine operations. So at first, I will explain the submarine development in the world. It's 1890s. France introduced the submarines fighting against the Royal Navy. So they want to compete with Royal Navy, but French Navy is its power is not enough. So they invented the submarines. And the United States is private shipping companies. It's called the Holland submarine torpedo boat companies and the Lake torpedo boat company developed the technique. And the U.S. Navy introduced the submarine in the turn of the 20th century. And also Britain introduced 5 submarines from United States in 1901. And Russia also got a license from the Holland submarine torpedo boat company from United States in 1901. So many world submarines is come from U.S. technique. And this is a Russian submarine. Its name is Delphin. But this is also look like a Holland submarine. It's of course it's licensed by Holland. But it's then now I want to explain about the Japanese Navy. It's Japanese Navy, Japanese Imperial Navy. It's established in the 1870s, beginning of 1870s. But at that time, Japan is still a developing country. It's Japan didn't have any army or navy at that time. So Japan introduced a navy from Britain. So Japanese Navy was completed the copy of the Royal Navy. And at that time, Japanese officers, many officers was studied at Royal Navy colleges. And Navy, it's introduced British warships, arms and naval equipment. For example, during the Russo-Japanese war time, it's 6 battleships and 6 heavy cruisers, all of them as made in Britain. And Russian Royal Navy at that time as something, it's underestimated the submarines. I don't know. It's that is a submarine itself or U.S. submarines or I don't know. But anyhow, Royal Navy has underestimated the submarines. And but on the other hand, Japanese it's naval officers studied in the United States made one report, and he reported that it emphasized that importance of submarine. But in Tokyo, Naval General Staff ignored the information. And early 1904, Japanese naval attaché to London also informed that submarine was useless, nothing. So it's Japanese Navy didn't want to introduce any submarines at that time. But it's 15th of May 1904. It's last session. It's told that 2 Japanese battleships were sunk by a mine, Russian mines off Port Arthur. But Japanese Imperial Navy didn't believe that. Oh, the Japanese Navy, its battleships never touched the mine. It's something, another weapon were attacked the Japanese battleships. And one, its warships alarmed that something it's surfaced and the dark water. What was that? And it's the Japanese naval general staff suspicion was it a mines or submarines torpedo attack? And then in Tokyo, it's Russian submarines attacked. Their suspicions was enlarged. But also, the Russian reaction to the Japanese submarines. Japan didn't have the submarines at that time in the April 04, but it's Russian battleships. Petropavlovsk also sunk, and also Russian naval attaches wanted to research that in the United States, that is it something as exported from United States to Japan, some submarine parts, and I found some documents in the Russian naval archives that its submarine parts was exported from Boston to Japan, from Quincy. Japanese reaction to the Russian submarine that Bakatsoran anti-submarine weapon was also developed in Japan, but it is also useless. But in the Japanese Navy was decided in June 1904 that to introduce its latest submarine technique, and latest submarine technique is it's developed in the United States, Japan believe, and it's introduced a Holland type electric boat. It's that is nowadays it's General Dynamics now. And 5 submarines assembled at the Fall River shipyard Quincy in June, between June to October 1904. And disassembled and smuggled them with 78 assemblymen into Japan. It's assemblymen, it's come from also Boston. And it's one famous, it's a submarine architect named Frank Cable. He came to Japan too. I read Frank Cable's report about that. And August 1905, submarine flotilla. Yes. I have. And this is a Japanese submarine imported from Boston. This is also the Holland type. And the first U.S.-Japanese naval cooperation in Boston was started in Navy. It's Japanese Navy is the first experience to cooperate with other than the Royal Navy. It's the first time to cooperate with the United States this time. And Royal Navy, not Russian Navy also imported 5 submarines by Lake Submarine Torpedo Boat Company in autumn 1904. And but not only Russian Navy, Japanese Navy also not only the 5 submarines but also invited the John Holland, his submarine architect, and built 2 new Holland submarines in Kobe. So Japan imported almost 7 submarines at that time, and many equipment imported from Quincy. And Poland got the Japanese order of rising sun in later. And Japanese naval documents, but those research, I would like to research more, but Japanese naval document was vanished in the end of the Second World War. So I could not find any more document in Japan, and I tried to find the document here, if it's possible. And it's day after tomorrow I'll go to MIT's archives to find the document if it's there are.
We hope.
We hope. So I hope that it's new. The U.S.-Japanese Naval Cooperation will be researched sooner. Thanks for your listening.
Our next speaker is Professor Tilchin, who is Associate Professor Emeritus of Social Sciences and History at Boston University. He taught here for 26 years, incredible. He is the author of Theodore Roosevelt and the British Empire, a study in presidential statecraft. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amy, and also thanks to Grant for organizing this really extraordinary conference. Theodore Roosevelt, the 26th President of the United States, was one of the foremost statesmen of modern history. He possessed a lucid and refined understanding of the complex world of his era. According to Henry Kissinger, writing in 1994, TR, quote, approached the global balance of power with a sophistication matched by no other American president. Moreover, Roosevelt, who served as president from 1901 to 1909, was a virtuoso in the realm of execution, pursuing his foreign policy objectives with remarkable skill and effectiveness. While far more sympathetic to Japan than to Russia, President Roosevelt fully comprehended the multidimensional international context of the Russo-Japanese War, and he believed it would be destabilizing for either combatant to be pushed entirely out of the East Asian picture. With France allied with Russia and Great Britain allied with Japan, Roosevelt also perceived a danger to the new and very promising Anglo-French Entente Cordiale. From the outset, TR was determined to do all that he could to bring this war to a satisfactory conclusion, a conclusion that would reestablish an East Asian balance of power and preserve the existing balance in Europe. And considering Russia's and Japan's relationships with the other great powers, and considering the impossibility of unbrokered direct talks between the two warring nations, Roosevelt recognized clearly that he was the only plausible mediator. TR had contemplated mediating even before the war began, but he knew that he could not force the issue. Upon the outbreak of the war, the president declared a U.S. policy of strict neutrality and then watched closely as events unfolded, hoping for an opportunity to stop the fighting. Roosevelt's patiently awaited opportunity at last arrived following the total Japanese naval victory at Tsushima in May 1905. The Russian regime of Tsar Nicholas II had suffered military humiliation and was on the edge of political collapse, while the Japanese government was under severe financial strain on account of the high cost of the war. Japan's foreign minister instructed its ambassador to the U.S. to solicit discreetly mediation by Roosevelt, who then sprang into action. In a detailed confidential letter dated June the 5th to his close friend, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, TR narrated recent developments. Quote, At the Japanese government's request, but to use their own expression, on my initiative, I told the Russian ambassador to say to the Tsar that I believed the war absolutely hopeless for Russia, that I earnestly desired that she and Japan should come together and see if they could not agree upon terms of peace, and that I should like to propose this if I could get the assent of Russia and then of Japan, which latter I thought I would be able to get. End of quote. Russia consented, provided that Japan would consent before knowing of Russia's acceptance. Roosevelt performed this dance with agility, and the two belligerent powers agreed to undertake peace negotiations, the location and the arrangements to be decided. Pleased with his achievement, but also realizing that the hardest work was just beginning, Roosevelt plunged into the task of setting up a conference. With Japan and Russia unable to agree on any European or Asian venue, and with the midsummer weather in Washington, D.C. too uncomfortable, Roosevelt began to focus on the Portsmouth Navy Yard in New Hampshire as a particularly suitable site. Portsmouth was sufficiently near Sagamore Hill, the summer White House in Oyster Bay, New York, for TR to monitor the conference and to intercede as needed. And it was a secure location where U.S. Marines could ensure the upholding of protocol. Naturally, Roosevelt would have preferred to gain agreement on key issues prior to the convening of the Portsmouth Conference. And his inability to do so made June and July a rather frustrating time for the president. Meanwhile, Japan seized possession of Sakhalin, a Russian island north of Japan, which was to become a crucial sticking point during the month preceding the conference. So, TR launched the conference in late July and early August by meeting at Sagamore Hill with the leaders of the two delegations, and then hosting a formal reception aboard the presidential yacht Mayflower on August 5th. The first two photographs pertain to this reception. Russia's ambassador to the United States, Baron Roman Romanovich Rosen, later observed in a memoir that the president had, quote, presided with admirable tact over the delicate ceremony. The delegates gathered in Portsmouth on August 8th with Assistant Secretary of State Herbert Pierce, the highest-ranking American present. And in their deliberations, they adhered to Roosevelt's suggestion that they discuss the most difficult terms last. TR was seeking to create, quote, a climate for compromise. Physically, the president was at Sagamore Hill and was now in the background. Paradoxically, however, he was the most important, indeed the indispensable participant in the conference. Of greatest consequence were Roosevelt's direct interactions with key players. The issues were multifaceted, and it was an extremely difficult challenge for TR to keep up with these negotiations and to guide them. Perhaps the two most important figures in Roosevelt's backstage peace conference diplomacy were Baron Kentaro Kaneko from Japan and George Meyer, appointed by TR in December 1904 to serve as U.S. ambassador to Russia. A distinguished statesman who had been a schoolmate of Roosevelt at Harvard, Kentaro Kaneko was sent to America by the Japanese government in 1904 to cultivate the goodwill of the American people and especially their president. In June and July 1905, before the conference opened, Roosevelt met with Kaneko and urged him to encourage his government to pursue a moderate, reasonable peace. During the decisive month of August, Kaneko visited TR at the summer White House at least 6 times. On August 18th, as Roosevelt was preparing to issue a personal appeal to the Russian Tsar, Kaneko helped the president draft this appeal, an astonishing example of their intimacy and of Roosevelt's fundamentally pro-Japanese outlook. As for TR's friend George Meyer, another Harvard schoolmate, he was transferred from Rome to St. Petersburg shortly after Roosevelt's close English friend Cecil Spring Rice, a diplomat then stationed in Russia, urged Roosevelt to send, quote, a really good ambassador here. In his confidential letter of appointment, Roosevelt noted America's long-standing difficulties with Russia over East Asia, not the least of which was Russia's, quote, literally fathomless mendacity. TR emphasized to Meyer, who had been anticipating a more desirable transfer to Paris, that the Russian ambassadorship had become, quote, the most important post in the diplomatic service, and that, quote, you are the man for that job. The choice of Meyer proved to be a wise and even an inspired one, for Meyer was highly effective both as a reporter and as an agent of Roosevelt's diplomacy. As the peace talks proceeded, in line with Roosevelt's counsel, Japan abandoned its most extreme demands. The Japanese delegation in Portsmouth did continue to insist, however, on a Russian indemnity and on retaining Sakhalin Island, demands that TR believed to be reasonable. But the dysfunctional and self-deluding government of Nicholas II adamantly rejected these demands, and so the prospects for peace appeared dim. Nevertheless, the president was determined to persist. Via Assistant Secretary Pierce, Roosevelt requested that the leader of the Russian delegation, Sergei Witte, dispatch a representative to Sagamore Hill, quote, so that I may through him send you a strictly confidential message. Witte delegated Ambassador Rosen, but Rosen's visit to Sagamore Hill turned out to be entirely unsatisfactory to Roosevelt. Around this time, fortunately, the vigilant Roosevelt discovered that the Japanese government was more desperate for peace and therefore more willing to compromise than the president had previously understood. In addition to the terms that had earlier and rather easily been agreed upon, among them Japanese control over Korea, it now appeared possible that peace could be attained on the basis of no Russian indemnity and the division of Sakhalin Island between the two belligerents. TR enlisted the support of German Kaiser Wilhelm II, who could sometimes influence his cousin the Tsar, on behalf of such a compromise, and he assigned Ambassador Meyer to speak with the Tsar in person. Meyer very impressively mobilized just the right arguments to persuade Nicholas to consent to a division of Sakhalin. Still, the week between August 23rd, when Meyer met with the Tsar, and August 29th, when final agreement was achieved, was filled with tension and frayed nerves in Tokyo, St. Petersburg, Oyster Bay, and Portsmouth. Although prepared to divide Sakhalin, Japan now wanted Russia to pay it for returning the northern half, which Russia was not willing to do. For his part, Roosevelt was incredibly busy during these pivotal days, pressing both sides and working every possible channel in his quest to break the deadlock. But ultimately, the question of peace or continued war was beyond the president's control, and as the final meeting of the chief Russian and Japanese delegates convened in Portsmouth, with the Russians ready to break off the talks and depart, Roosevelt could only wait and hope. In Portsmouth, at the last moment, Japan yielded. Sakhalin would be divided at the 50th parallel without payment, with Japan retaining the southern half. Peace had been attained. A week later, the formal signing of the treaty took place. Despite internal unhappiness with the treaty in Russia and Japan, both governments appreciated the difficulty and the significance of Roosevelt's diplomatic feat. In his book, The Treaty of Portsmouth, An Adventure in American Diplomacy, Eugene Trani offers the following summary assessment of TR's work, quote, "It was clearly a Roosevelt-managed peace. The conference had assembled on his initiative. He had convinced the Japanese and the Russians of the need for it. His preaching made the powers think of moderate terms. His influence was especially apparent on the Japanese. Roosevelt kept the conference going by constant contact with the plenipotentiaries and their governments." End of quote. During the closing phase of the conference, Trani contends TR's communication through Meyer with the Russian government was particularly consequential. The commemorative plaque on Building 86 at the Portsmouth Navy Yard, shown in the third photograph, reads in its entirety as follows. In this building, at the invitation of Theodore Roosevelt, President of the United States, was held the peace conference between the envoys of Russia and Japan, and September 5th, 1905 at 3:47 p.m. was signed the Treaty of Portsmouth, which ended the war between the two empires. By his extraordinary diplomatic effort, President Theodore Roosevelt had brought to a halt a very destructive war, while restoring an East Asian balance of power and protecting the Anglo-French Entente Cordiale, a major asset to the Anglo-American partnership that constituted the cornerstone of Rooseveltian foreign policy. When the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to TR in 1906, he was an entirely worthy recipient. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Professor Inaba,
Yes.
part 2.
Yes, my next presentation is Russo-Japanese negotiation on the brink of collapse and the U.S. mediation. Because it's when 5 years ago I read the one Russian scholar's article about the Portsmouth Peace Treaty, and in that article, Russian scholar says that it's Roosevelt is pro-Russian. But I completely believe that Roosevelt should be pro-Japanese. But what does happen then? It's a very big question for me. And it's I also read the Roosevelt's letters published in the Harvard University Press. It is written that Roosevelt was introduced there, that Roosevelt introduced by himself, that I speak as an earnest well-wisher of Russia. But in the official diplomatic history of Japanese diplomatic history, it's called Komura Gaikoshi, that it is written that Roosevelt gave a lot of profitable advices, and the Harvard University Press read Roosevelt letter that I am a true friend of Japan. Roosevelt was a pro-Japanese or pro-Russian, or both, or my feeling was like that pro-Japanese means that there's something anti-Russian. And most of Japanese thought like that, but was Roosevelt is so? It's my biggest question. So, and the final session of the peace negotiations, it's the head of the Japanese delegation is Jutaro Komura. And the head of the Russian delegation is Sergei Witte. And it's something chronicles I just talk is that it's outbreak of the Russo-Japanese war is the 10th of February, but it's Japanese was something always advancing the war, and the 1st of January 1905, Port Arthur was surrendered by Japanese army, and 1st and 10th of March, the Battle of Mukden, the Russian army withdrew from Mukden and Japan occupied the Mukden. But Russia didn't acknowledge its defeat. And Japanese army is planned to crush all of Russian army, but the Japanese army would not repeal Russian army in Harbin anymore because it's not any more powers of fight against Russia. So on 27th and 8th, the Battle of Tsushima, Japanese great triumph. But at the beginning of June, Japan asked Roosevelt the mediation of peace, and Roosevelt accepted the mediation and asked Russian side. And in August, the peace negotiation was in Portsmouth and concluded. The treaty is 5th of September and October 15th and 16th. The both ratify the peace treaty and the end of war. And the mediator is Roosevelt, and here is Nicholas II. It's also stressed. So now I start to talk a little bit about the negotiations. It's 18th of August. Japanese, Komura proposed that Russia should seize the southern Sakhalin because already Japan occupied all of Sakhalin. But Japan returned the northern Sakhalin, but Russia paid some kind of reparations. But August 19th, Tsar Nicholas said, not 1 inch of land, not a ruble. So then it's Roosevelt mediation. Tsar accepted the cession of Southern Sakhalin. And 25th, US-Japanese Sagamore Hill meeting. It's a Kaneko visited the Sagamore Hill. And Roosevelt advised the withdrawal of reparations. But Roosevelt never informed the cession of Southern Sakhalin. Why? It's again the question. And Komura planned for rupturing the negotiations at that time. And Komura planned to changing the place of next negotiation from Portsmouth to somewhere, New York or somewhere. And Witte tactics was postpone to show the compromise as long as possible. He is also a tough negotiator. And August 28th, Tokyo in cabinet meeting with Empire and decided that accept the peace without the cession of Sakhalin nor reparations. So, but a few hours later, a British minister in Tokyo informed that Tsar decided to seize southern Sakhalin on 23rd. Oh, we didn't know at all. So now we know. Okay, we changed the decision, so we can get the southern Sakhalin. So a wire from Tokyo to Portsmouth and to Komura and accept peace on no reparation, but we can get the southern Sakhalin. But again, it's a question is why didn't Roosevelt inform the Russian compromise? He should be a pro-Japanese. But on the other hand, Roosevelt stood as a complete neutral stance. But his neutral stance is not legal in international laws. But rather practical means that it's Russia, it's United States, it's secretly exported arms to those international law says a state declared neutrality must not export any arms to the Belgian country, but United States. 5 submarines to Russia and Japan, but not only submarines. Other arms Japan imported from United States also. So now it's I don't know why. And I would like to ask all of the audience that it's why Roosevelt didn't inform the Russian compromise to Japanese delegation, and one is Roosevelt prepared this SIM card. He's maybe the very good card player, and he's concealing this SIM card somewhere, and he prepared for the next or final table of negotiations. It's one. And second is Roosevelt thought that Japan had got too much territories already. Japan got all of Korea. And southern Sakhalin, southern Manchuria also Japan occupied. So Roosevelt thought Japan has already too much territory, need not anymore southern Sakhalin, or it's Roosevelt was a real peace feeder and to get a peace, want to get a peace and fight between Russia and Japan. Or I'd like to ask all of our audience. Okay, thanks for your listening.
Thank you so much. Our last speaker on the panel is Charles B. Zoliak, who is the president of the Japan-America Society of New Hampshire and the founder and moderator of the Portsmouth Peace Treaty Forum and the New Hampshire Superior Court meeting.
Well, we've got a difference of opinion, perhaps, on some things. I'm not going to talk about differences of opinion. I'm going to talk about process, what happened in Portsmouth for the 30 days of the negotiations, and see if that adds some insight into this and adds some further fuel to exactly what was going on in the process for peace. We're going to talk about adding to this bedlam that was going on in Portsmouth is local people, citizen diplomacy, creating the atmosphere and priorities of the people at this table during the time of the negotiations deadlocked and before. Professor Tillich has laid out a very nice premise to how we got to Portsmouth. When we got to Portsmouth, what happened? The people from Portsmouth were ready for the delegates to arrive. They had prepared, they had arranged for Wentworth by the Sea. Wentworth by the Sea to be the place where the delegates could stay. And they did that at local expense. In Portsmouth, they have a shipyard, which is what Roosevelt wanted to be the place where the formal negotiations took place, as Professor Tillich admirably already pointed out, was prepared in 4 days with 200 people from a naval storage facility into a suite of negotiation rooms and a dining facility for the negotiators to do the formal negotiations. This is all local citizen participation in creating the atmosphere and the appropriateness of the peace negotiations. For peace negotiations to occur, you need to start with a couple of things. One, the parties themselves are ready. And we already talked a lot about that. The fact that Tsushima had happened, the fact that the Russians had political problems at home, and the fact that the Japanese needed to end the war because of the cost to them. They were running out of money and their bankers were worried about it. And everybody cared about what public opinion thought of the peace negotiations because that affected what was going to happen with their bankers. So there was already this concept that public opinion mattered. And both Kaneko for the Japanese was fostering it and Vinte for the Russians were fostering it the whole time. So when the peace negotiations were determined to be at Portsmouth, because Roosevelt wanted them there, the local people from Portsmouth, along with their state government, went down to the Japanese embassy and the Russian embassy and invited them both to come to New Hampshire or Portsmouth. And that was not a formal invitation at first. It was set informally by the congressional delegation, the executive council, and the governor, because New Hampshire cared about tourism. They wanted the negotiations to be at a hotel in New Hampshire, which was in the tourist business. And they had great hotels in the Lakes region, and they had Wentworth by the Sea on the ocean. So they wanted the negotiations to be successful. So first of all, you got to have the parties that want to go to negotiate. Second of all, you got to have a mediator who's neutral. We've already heard from two people about those two factors being considered the case. Russia was allied with the French. The British were allied with the Japanese. Roosevelt was neutral, and so he was the only major player that could do it. But I agree with Professor Tillich that he wanted to do it. Very interesting about that. He wanted to do it. If he tried to vote on it with Congress, they probably wouldn't want to be involved because they were isolationists, but not Roosevelt. He wanted to make a mark. He wanted the United States to enter the world stage, not speaking softly and carrying a big stick, but being the person who could be the mediator of the end of the largest hot war ever fought between two nations up until that time. He really wanted to do that, so he put himself, as Professor Tillich said, into the forefront of that. But we got a problem. The problem is you've got to have a mediator or negotiator who is very wise and tactical. Why? Because Roosevelt was not wanted to be at the table as a mediator by either the Japanese or the Russians. The Russians had a problem with the Europeans taking away their peace negotiation results with Europeans when they were fighting the Turks, and the Japanese had had the same problem when they were negotiating with the Chinese over the Sino-Japanese War in 1895. So they didn't want Roosevelt at the table. So Roosevelt needed a hospitable place that could provide the informal backdrop and hospitality that was needed to keep the delegates taken care of. So he found out that New Hampshire wanted to do it. He knew that New Hampshire had the hospitality capability. They had the naval shipyard. So he said, we'll do it in Portsmouth. And immediately the first thing the people in Portsmouth did, after Roosevelt met with the delegates at Oyster Bay, they welcomed the delegates with a magnificent parade. And this had an effect on the delegates right away. They all noticed that this was a parade of the National Guard. You can't see the National Guard in the parade, but you can see how the people are dressed, all dressed. See the hats, etc. So formally, on a hot August day to welcome the delegates, and had an effect. If you're in a mediation, you've got to be in a spot and in a place where you think you're going to be treated impartially, that you're going to have your own voice, that you're going to have autonomy, and that you're going to get fair play. And they thought that was going to be the case if they could negotiate with themselves directly. And Roosevelt essentially was a very good tactician, arranged for that to occur. He knew that the local people would take care of them. But rather than go into the negotiations in particular, I'd like to add in onto this what other citizen diplomacy mattered. At the end of the parade, this is all the delegates and the people that were involved in providing informal events with the delegates and others that had been involved in the parade. That started, it was the first day of the negotiations. Now, I'm not going to give an opinion on how this happened. I'm going to do something that's where the formal negotiations start. That's what the next day. I'm going to start with a tough diagram. It shows how the negotiations work over time. And you can see with this diagram, perhaps, whether or not certain things had a correlation that mattered beyond just the formal delegates. At the top of the diagram is the back channel diplomacy by Roosevelt. Time, this is July, August, by week, by day. The top part of the diagram does the back channel diplomacy, which the past two speakers have talked about. Roosevelt with Myers being sent to the Tsar, Kaneko connecting with Roosevelt, and the questions that Professor Nabi has indicated is in there. And then at the final, this is when the Genro finally decided on their own to accept the peace without an indemnity and with only half of Sakhalin. The middle part of the diagram starts with a parade over here, but it's every day, and it's got every day with 24 hours, so you can show the time that was involved. The yellow indicates the actual time of the formal negotiations and the days they occurred. Beneath there, at the bottom, are the 12 demands that the Japanese and the Russians were negotiating about, and when each one of those particular points of interest or claims were resolved. And it shows the days, shows the negotiation. It shows the days when the negotiation took care of that particular claim. Now, Roosevelt had said a number of things to the delegates before they went. He didn't go to the table with them, but he asked them to do, like what Professor Tillich said, a number of things. One, were they not deadlocked over one item? If there was an item they couldn't agree on, skip over it and see if you can settle it with the items below that. which is exactly what they did. When they got to the indemnity thing, they didn't stop. They got to the indemnity thing, they didn't stop. They kept talking, and essentially got a resolution of all but two things, and they talked about that, suckling and the indemnity. But the suckling and indemnity thing happened. There were 9 days of formal negotiations. That's the timeline. That were successful, and then a break of 11 days when they were deadlocked. And it's at that time that this part of the diagram fits further. This is all the informal connections that the parties had with the local people and the Navy during the entire period that they were there. From lawn parties to church services, to athletic games, to movies, to artistic events, to the excursions on ships. Those were the kinds of things local people were doing to keep the delegates at the table while the actual negotiations broke down. One of the events was they went to the Amherst-Keg meals in Manchester, New Hampshire, with the Russian delegation. They went on boat excursions, etc. The idea was to keep a positive atmosphere about the negotiations, to don't break them off, give the people time. Now this is an important concept in mediation. If you're a mediator, and I'm a mediator, the first rule of the game is you want the two sides to decide. That's what you want to do. That might be an answer to your question, by the way. You want the two sides to decide. You don't want to interfere in the negotiations. You don't want to say something about the negotiations that the one side tells you that you don't have authority to tell the other side. Okay? So the bottom line is, that may be the answer to your question, not to answer it too quickly. But Roosevelt was not really mediating. He was observing where everything was, and when a particular item turned to be a roadblock, guess what? This is the back-channel diplomacy during the time when the deadlock was created over the armistice, over the indemnity and Stockholm. And look what happened. That's when Roosevelt really kicked in. He didn't kick in before that. He didn't have to. But when there was a deadlock, he did. And look what happened to the local people. They kicked in to create a positive atmosphere for that. And buying time. That's the last and most important thing in the negotiation. Time. People have to have time to observe their interests, their true interests, not their quick interests, not their position interests. Not, yes, I agree or don't agree to a particular item. Over time, what matters? So the Japanese general, understanding their economic position, said, what's our situation? And because Roosevelt had told them, and they had created a resolution of all these items here. By the way, the two items that they did not agree on did not include the items that Japan had gone to war over. They went to war over control of Korea and Manchuria primarily. They had settled all that. The only issue was paying for the war and Sakhalin Island. So when the Japanese general really looked at their interests over time, the people staying at the table being aided in that regard by the local populace encouraging them to do that with their events that provided hospitality and a positive atmosphere. The general made their decision and created peace, and I'm out of time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for all of these papers. I really learned a lot, and all of these papers made me really reconsider the United States' role in the world, and especially the role within the kind of broader system of European diplomacy. It also made all of these papers in different ways made me rethink Japan's role in international politics as well. And so I wonder if we couldn't think more broadly, that's what I'm going to talk to you, about the global response to Japan Japan's victory over Russia. And I'm just going to very briefly offer the Ottoman case because there was a profound reaction to it in that empire. So this was a war that was widely reported upon in the press. There were commemorative books published about the war and also specifically about the treaty. It was an event that trickled down to cultural production. One of my favorite novels from 1911 is a murder mystery. It was a bestseller. Sherlock Holmes has to come to the Ottoman Empire to solve the mystery. But the novel begins with Istanbul just seething with rumor that what is happening? How is this possible? The Japanese have defeated one of the great powers. What does this mean for the future of the Ottoman Empire? What does this mean for the future of global politics and Japan's role within global politics? So historian Jamil Aydin argues that Japan's victory over Russia was one of the central events in the non-Western, non-Christian world, which many contemporaries at the time talked about as an Asian awakening, and that it was a kind of proof against Western racial and cultural superiority. And we can see this across the Middle East, across Asia, India, Egypt. Just to give you one very brief example, Ahmed Riza, an Ottoman politician, this is what he had to say about the Japanese victory. Quote, "The splendid victory of the Japanese has proved the Christian world arrogant, that it is not indispensable for a people to embrace Christianity in order to acquire morality, civilization, and an appetite for progress. The more isolated and preserved from contact with European invaders and plunderers a people is, the better is the measure of its evolution towards a rational renovation." This episode of Japan winning was so important. There was a massive conference in Istanbul, also in 1911, that was an analysis of Japan. It was the Renaissance of Japan is what it was called. And there was this big question, can we modernize the way that Japan has? And ultimately, in the Ottoman Foreign Ministry was part of this conference, ultimately the argument was that Japan offered a new path for establishing equality in international relations. So I guess what I'd ask all of the panelists to kind of think about, because it really, again, made me think about the interests of all the different players, of Japan, of Russia, also of the United States. In many ways, we might see all three of these powers being kind of at the edges of the Eurocentric international order represented by the Concert of Europe. So, Professor Inaba, I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about why Japan wanted the United States to broker the peace. Why not rely upon concert diplomacy? Was that an option? Was it the Russians who pushed back against that? Also, what did the United States think that it was doing by hosting this conference? And that's actually a question for all of the panelists. Professor Tilchin, I wondered if you could say a bit more about why President Roosevelt was more sympathetic to Japan than Russia. I was really struck by this idea of this kind of American obsession with an Asian balance of power in this early period, and wondered if you could say a bit more. Is it about the new American empire in the Philippines? What is sort of driving American foreign policy? And then Charles, I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about, again, why the United States was hosting this conference, and what does citizen diplomacy do? Because there's like different nodes in this amazing graph that you've created for us. There's different nodes when Teddy Roosevelt, or when Roosevelt matters, there's moments when the citizen diplomacy matters. So I just was wondering if you could say more about the implications of citizen diplomacy for these kind of great power stories. Thank you.
Go in the order you asked the question.
Oh yes, why not? Yeah, we can also go through.
Okay. Amy was asking, I think, about why TR was more favorable to Japan. And, I mean, a couple things. In TR's global concepts, he viewed Britain as the essential ally of the United States. He had come to see France as a benign, friendly, useful power as well. He saw Russia and Germany both with great suspicion and viewed them as potential enemies of the United States, which was one of the reasons he wanted to build up American naval power and to forge a strong partnership with Great Britain. Japan, he had a more ambivalent view of. He admired the Japanese, the way they had modernized. By the way, his view of Japan really undermines the charges that he was a racist. That's something I've had to deal with a lot in my career. He was actually a very progressive racial thinker for his time. And he looked at the Japanese as potentially a constructive great power. He also wanted to be friendly with Japan because he was concerned about U.S. interests in the Philippines. But it went well beyond that. He favored the Anglo-Japanese alliance. He did a lot to try to fortify it. But at the same time, he wasn't sure about Japan. And so he felt the U.S. had to build up its naval power in the Pacific just in case. And I would just go beyond 1905 very briefly here. In his final several years as president, Tia really did forge a friendly understanding between the U.S. and Japan that dealt with all the major issues between them, including the very sensitive issue of the immigration of Japanese laborers to the United States. He essentially downplayed the open door policy and believed that Japan should have a predominant position in Manchuria, even though he couldn't say it exactly that way, but it's certainly what he believed and what his policy indicated. He left U.S.-Japan relations in really good shape for his successors, and they didn't do a very good job with his legacy. But anyway, yeah, he saw much more promise in a future constructive relationship with Japan than with either Russia or Germany, at least for the foreseeable future while he was president.
Yes, it's something very much curious that the United States is pro-Japanese. Very much curious because it's something. For example, I'm researching also the undersea cable affairs, and it's Japan wanted to build an undersea cable between Japan and the United States in the time of the Russo-Japanese War, because it's Japanese cable was, Japan believed that it intercepted by Russians in Shanghai. So Japan didn't want to send a telegram via Shanghai to any other countries, but it's the United States again at that time also says that it's no, now is the time of the Russo-Japanese War. It's impossible for United States to build the direct cable between United States and Japan. It helps something for Japan, means that the United States is not anymore the strict neutrality, but the United States was exactly strict neutrality at all. Always it's something exported arms to each others, but sometimes they like that. So what is really United States thought? But United States wanted to be more practical, strict neutrality for the same stance for Russia and same stance for Japan, but show to Japanese that I'm a pro-Japanese, and to show to the Russian I'm a pro-Russians, and it's something. It's very good diplomacy to see at that time, or how do you think about yes, answer?
One citizen diplomacy, look at the term multi-track diplomacy is part of every State Department in the world's format of diplomacy, which is having informal relationships that support formal negotiations. Classic example was the welcoming parade. We created a tremendous citizen diplomacy by showing up and being enthusiastic welcoming the delegates, making them feel equal, making them feel heard, making them feel confident they will be able to get it over with. You create an atmosphere in the Portsmouth Peace Treaty that's similar to an atmosphere in the Olympics. Every citizen was into it. Everybody wanted the peace negotiations to be successful. And when the delegates walked down the street, met with people, were taken to their homes, were taken to their businesses, were taken to church services, etc., this positive ion was going on all the time. And nowadays, citizen diplomacy is just having a kid come from a foreign country come to your house and creating a bond with them. Multi-track diplomacy often is talked about in terms of business to business, teacher to teacher, from different countries, especially countries that don't like each other very much. So these informal personal relationships support formal diplomacy. I'd like to comment on one thing if I can. It's my understanding that the Russo-Japanese War now is considered the beginning of decolonization, of European decolonization in the world. A number of historians have said that. This is the first example of essentially non-white people using modern arms to defeat Western power. This is the beginning of the end of racial superiority of whites in a major way.
Let me just say one word before this, if you don't mind.
Not at all.
And that is that Professor Inaba has actually organized a conference, quite like our conference here, similar topic, that's taking place in Shikoku in Japan. So this idea that we're here remembering, studying, trying to understand that there's a parallel operation going on in the month of June in Japan, and that he's inviting people to go there. You can talk to him about it. Just to say that this is a big issue not only here, but around the globe. Thank you.
Thank you, Roy, for the introduction, and thank you to all the panelists this morning. I was tasked with summarizing all of the papers, and let's count them. There's 2 on the military theorists and how they saw the war, 1 on memory, 3 on military operations, and then another 3 on the peace. So let's start first with Dr. Holmes' paper. He wasn't here to present it, but he basically set it up as this struggle between, on the one hand, Abdel Mahan, and on the other hand, Julian S. Corbett, whose theories would be vindicated by the Russo-Japanese War. And his argument is, in the paper, is that it's Corbett who is vindicated. Corbett, first of all, rejected the notion that Japan's victory was the result of a command of the seas approach, which was a theory that was associated with Alfred Mahan, and which saw and emphasized strategic offense early in the stages of the war in the form either of a battle or a blockade. And he said that this is not actually what happened. The Japanese actually used a joint forces approach that included on one hand naval forces, on the other hand land forces, and that they husbanded their resources and used them only at the best appropriate time. He leaves us with the idea that really the way we should think about these 2 different military theories is that Mahan explains a sort of a grand strategy theory, how you acquire the tools to be a great naval power through commerce, but Corbett actually tells you how to then use those tools to win a conflict. Professor Maurer's paper doesn't really disagree with this, I think. I don't think the conflict that Professor Holmes set up was sort of responded to by Professor Maurer. I think they essentially agree on how to characterize Mahan. So Mahan believed that the world was sort of filled with great powers that had acquired their strength through strength in the Maritimes, and saw both the history of the previous 2 centuries and that of the future as being characterized by inevitable, endless struggle for maritime supremacy, and that the United States would have to exit its period of isolation and join in the fray. Right? one of the main reasons why Mahan wanted this is he wanted to compensate for Britain's decline in power. And he thought that Britain needed support to face off threats. Initially, before the Russo-Japanese War, that threat was Russia. And then after the Russo-Japanese War, we see Mahan pivot and say, no, it's actually now Germany and Japan. So what he imagines is, at the very beginning, before the Russo-Japanese War, a coalition of the Teutonic powers, including the US, Britain, Germany, and Japan. And later, he switches to a strategy that focuses more on Germany and Japan. In terms of military strategy, Mahan reacts to the war by criticizing the decision to spread out the Russian resources in two fleets, right? This is actually strikingly similar to what Korbevazan had. You have to, rather than try to take the initiative too soon, make sure to concentrate all your naval resources until they're ready to strike. Something that I found interesting, in the second paper, but also the first paper, Mahan is sort of portrayed as a prophet of the future, of these global conflicts that characterize the 20th century. But he's also in some ways a contributor, right? There was a generation of military theorists who portrayed war as inevitable, and in doing so, also helped make it a reality. Like, this was a self-fulfilling prophecy by basically rejecting the international law that was emerging at the time, international institutions. They helped sort of also cement the ideas that really this was the only path to great power status, and I think that needs to be acknowledged. Then we have a paper by Professor Lau Goldstein. It looks at Russia's Central Naval Museum and the coverage, the relatively sparse coverage of this important conflict, which looms so large in the history of naval warfare, but in this museum is afforded only one room in comparison to that of the Second World War, where Russia's naval activity is much smaller. And the insight here is that nations generally don't like to linger on their defeats and on their more shameful and humiliating sides of their history. Despite the lack of coverage in terms of this museum, Professor Goldstein reminds us that in the literature, the specialist literature, the war is constantly talked about, and for two reasons. First, as a sort of a warning that Russia needs to be prepared, and that this might be contributing to sort of Russian paranoia, especially with respect to East Asia. And the second point, that Russia is vulnerable because its neighbors, either Japan, Ukraine, other neighbors, can be supported by its strategic rivals. So there's a strong emphasis in the Russian literature, and not just, I would say, recently, but even at the time, that Japan achieves what it achieves because of British and US support. So that's the first three set of papers. Then we have another three batch of papers that look more at military operations, right? So we start off here with Kozyrev's paper, and there's, I say, two main points. First of all, that Russia is unprepared, generally, and the other one that it suffers poor leadership passivity. And these two explanations, they're not necessarily in tension, but if you push this to say which one is the more important one, there is a slight tension in between them. Because if, as for instance, Admiral Stepan Makarov thought, if he foresaw Russia's defeat simply by Japan having taken the initiative, then basically unpreparedness is the only response. On the other hand, unpreparedness mixed with poor leadership, it can sort of create, the unpreparedness can be a contributing factor to poor leadership, because if you're fatalistic about the outcome of the war, that may lead you to become more passive. So I'm going to count the different forms of unpreparedness, right? We were referred to the technological and economic backwardness of the Russian forces, the various shortages they faced, the corruption, the disorganization, and then there's also this other factor, the passivity. The question then is which one was more important? Were they both significant? And in terms of their wartime posture, the Russia focused on winning time, on gradual strengthening, whereas Japan focused much more on speed and acknowledge its limited resources, which by the end of the war were pretty exhausted. And then we had two papers by Professor Inaba on different dimensions of first of all, one on military operations and another one on the peace treaty. So I'm going to talk about the one on military operations. This one focused on submarine warfare and the fact that Japan had acquired submarines from the United States. They were never used, but fear of submarines prompted anti-submarine measures both by Russia and by Japan. And that the research for this interesting finding is largely based on US archives, the Japanese ones having been destroyed. The last three papers were on the Portsmouth conference. And again, Professor Inaba introduced to us this idea that goes against the wave that maybe Roosevelt was pro-Russian, right? And then the question comes like, in what way could Roosevelt have been pro-Russian, given that the conventional wisdom is that he was pro-Japanese? And Professor Inaba also illustrates this by showing Roosevelt's approach was a bit two-faced. With the Russians, he claimed to be pro-Russian. With the Japanese, he claimed to be pro-Japanese. The paper examines why Roosevelt withheld key information from the Japanese about Russia's willingness to cede the southern half of Sakhalin Islands to Japan. And the ultimate answer seems to be that he wanted to retain. The ultimate answer seems to be that there's no clear answer. But in the slides, there's or is it the paper? I believe it's maybe the paper. There was a suggestion that Roosevelt wanted to maintain leverage if negotiations became prolonged, and that this leverage could have been useful. Then we have two accounts about further accounts about the negotiations, and they both interesting focus on the hosts, both in terms of the mediator, like Theodore Roosevelt, and the citizens of Portsmouth as playing the critical role, being decisive actors in this negotiation. So first we have Professor Tilchin, who argues that Roosevelt was the central character, and says that Roosevelt's primary motivation was to reestablish a balance of power in East Asia. And a secondary goal was to ensure that the balance of power also remained stable in Europe, by ensuring that the conflict in East Asia did not somehow spill or lead to a breakdown in relations between Britain and France. You'll recall that Britain and France each had an ally involved in this war, and they had recently concluded the Entente Cordiale, and an understanding that involved a wide-ranging imperial settlement, and Roosevelt didn't want this to fall apart. So what did he do? He sent his good friend George Meyer to St. Petersburg to be involved in the negotiations, and throughout the conference, he was also close to Baron Kaneko, and they drafted documents to help prod both sides to work together. And as a result, is the argument, Japan moderated its demands, but still demanded an indemnity and Sakhalin Island. And because of Japanese desperation, and because Roosevelt's knowledge of Japanese desperation, Roosevelt was then able to, in the final days, apply pressure on Japan to have them drop these final remaining demands for the southern half of the island and for the indemnity. The last paper by Mr. Doliak argues that local citizens created the atmosphere for peace, and argues that public opinion was key to resolving the 11-day deadlock in negotiations. Essentially, and sort of the part of the proof that the citizen diplomacy was effective is partly you saw it on that chart in terms of the activities organized in Portsmouth. Partly it's also in the fact that the lead Russian negotiator twice rejected orders to break off negotiations, sending telegrams that he would continue to do so. Something that I found interesting about, especially the last two papers, is that they do not use US or Japanese sources, the kind that would shed a light on the actual thinking and decision-making of the key decision-makers. Like, to what extent did the citizens of Portsmouth sort of create a sense of obligation among the two delegations to stay and keep working out? To what extent did Roosevelt's pressure force Sergei Witte or his Japanese counterparts to make various concessions at certain points in time? That's what the kind of information, this type of information, the only place where you'd find it is sometimes in the memoirs, although memoirs are less reliable, more likely in the telegrams explaining back home why you're taking a certain position. And it would have been useful to get that critical information and perhaps make it a bit less centered on the United States. It would have been interesting maybe if they had said in those telegrams, Roosevelt was why we did this, citizens of Portsmouth were critical, but those are sort of the sources that you'd rely on, rather than the kind of the narrative that the citizens of Portsmouth wants everybody to believe, or that the champions of Roosevelt want them to believe. So desperate to get some more information, I myself went and found the most readily available primary source, which is Sergei Vita's memoirs. There's two editions, one from 1921 that is rather bowdlerized, it's sort of like edited for the US market and is missing a lot of critical information, and then there's another one in 1990 that is the more complete version. And it's interesting because it kind of goes against some of these claims. For instance, Vita was not happy with the atmosphere in Portsmouth. He complained about the cramped quarters and the fact that one of his rooms apparently was encased in glass and attracted gawking tourists who denied him of his privacy. He has very interesting ideas about US cuisine. He says that it's dangerous food, and he basically says that Baron Komura fell ill after the conference because of the tendency in the US to refrigerate food and serve it cold. And then when it comes to Roosevelt's role, he doesn't give much credit to Roosevelt. He thinks Roosevelt is working for his own motives, selfishly, to sort of get more publicity. And as you might expect, Witte claims all the credit for himself. One of his arguments is that he was able to mobilize public opinion in the United States by appealing to sympathy, common racial sympathy, and by sort of emphasizing the alienness of the Japanese race. Now, we shouldn't take Witte at face. Maybe he's lying. Maybe he's just like an anti-American, and that's his account. Probably his memoirs are less reliable than the telegrams that were actually sent home. But the job of the historian is to use everything possible and then explain like why the inadequacies of certain sources, the strengths of others, and provide a larger account that hopefully, as part of global history, goes beyond the narratives left to us by Roosevelt's champions or by the citizens of Portsmouth. It was a great start to the conference, and I invite you all now to join me for lunch.
Here, I don't know when the last really popular World's Fair was, but maybe Expo 67 or something around it, when World's Fairs were the destination for family vacations. Since the advent of modern World's Fairs, with the Crystal Palace exhibition in London in 1851, World's Fairs have provided a stage upon which aspects of cultures can be presented, and cultures can present themselves for the first time to huge audiences that were very thirsty for knowledge about the world and their place in the world. The huge impact of these early World's Fairs is really hard to overstate. For example, the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, drew nearly 20 million visitors. That's 1/4 of the entire American population attended at some point over the course of 18 or 19 months this fair in St. Louis. And it shaped people's perceptions about the cultures that were put on display there. That's a particularly interesting fair because that was the first time, as was mentioned earlier by Professor Dickinson, these World's Fairs are a chance for the host country to showcase their industrial might, their agricultural might, their mineral wealth, etc. And the 1904 World's Fair was America's first opportunity to show off its new colonial holdings. And so they set up the largest exhibit at that World's Fair was the Philippine Village, bringing over 1,200 Filipinos to be exhibited au natural in downtown St. Louis. It was a fascinating experience for the fair goers. Anthropologically, it's a really weird sort of setting of wanting to display these cultures in their natural setting, yet also in this context of a Victorian American society that didn't like nudity, didn't like all sorts of things. And interestingly and very timely, there are rumors very quickly that the Philippine Village was running out of dogs that they needed to cook for dinners, and newspapers were publishing warnings for people to lock up their pets. It certainly has echoes in the recent presidential election. But these World's Fairs were really important. And as was described by the St. Louis promoters about their main exhibition area, to see the Pike, that's what the main exhibition street was called, to see the Pike is to see the whole world. For many fairgoers, these World's Fairs provided their first personal encounters with Asia at a time of growing business, military, technological, and Christian missionary interactions between East and West. Over the last few years, a number of us at BU and other institutions have been working on a really fun digital humanities project that we call Asia at the World's Fairs, an online exhibition of cultural exchange, to explore how Asian cultures were presented or presented themselves on these vast international stage through these exhibitions. It's meant to be very broad and very inclusive. These fairs, our project is sort of focusing from the mid-19th century, the 1851 fair, through the late 20th century, but we don't really have any particular bounds. We're trying to divide the project or organize the project by themes, architecture, dance, cultural diplomacy, anthropology, food, etc. And within each theme, we're inviting scholars to put together case studies that show in some detail particularly interesting aspects of these interactions. So far, we have a number of exhibits completed. Professor Alice Zhang, who will be speaking later this afternoon, has already finished her exhibition on presenting the Japanese pavilion, the Oden, at the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago. It's a really fascinating exploration of how the stage was set through growing Western tourism to Japan, the development of a tourist photography industry focusing on landscapes and sort of daily life scenes that Western tourists were really interested in seeing, and how that sort of lays the stage for this great excitement for seeing the Japanese exhibits in the 1893 Columbian Exposition. Here's some of the many archival photos. You'll hear more about Japan at these World's Fairs in two ways. I hope you have had or will soon have a chance to look at the ongoing streaming exhibition of the summary history of Japan at the World's Fairs that Professor Zhang and our art history PhD student, soon to be completed PhD student Connie Robles has put together. It's streaming on the monitors out in the lobby that looks at both what's happening in Japan at different time periods and how that's reflected in their exhibits at the fairs at different times from the 1850s through the 21st century. Japan's presence at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair will be explored in some detail this afternoon. It's a really important example of how an exhibition can be used by a country to paint a certain picture that they want the Western world and America in particular to understand. And Japan becomes really, really savvy at this. And they follow up the 1904 exhibition with an important exhibition in Milan in 1906, the really important British-Japan exhibition in 1910, and the really important 1933 exhibition at the Chicago Century of Progress World's Fair, where Japan presents a view of itself to try to enamor Americans to Japanese culture at a time that it's very actively expanding its militarism in East and Southeast Asia. Another exhibition that's currently finished is Kathy Ye. She's a professor in our World Language and Literature program, and she has an exhibition on the intersection of Asian dance at the World's Fairs, focusing primarily on the 1900 Paris Exposition. Kathy looks at traditional Asian dance, what Westerners knew about Asian dance before the 1900 Exposition. All of these World's Fairs like to host traditional arts and crafts and performances. So in Paris there were Javanese dancers, Vietnamese dancers, traditional Khmer dancers, etc. Kathy's interest in it is really looking at the intersection of these Asian dance troupes and the growing interest in modern Western dance, especially as shown by this really interesting American dancer, Loie Fuller from Illinois, who really rapidly became the belle of the ball. If you get into the literature, everybody wanted to hang out with Loie Fuller in Paris. And in Kathy's exhibition, she explores how Loie Fuller is entranced by these Asian dance troupes and begins to adopt some of their traditional dance moves, and how the Asian dance troupes are similarly impacted by Loie Fuller's modern dance. And this can then be tracked through the 19-teens, 1920s, 1930s, around the world many times, looking at the developments of the incorporation of Asian dance with American modernist dance companies like the Denishon Dance Troupe in California, and looking at changes in Asian dance troupes by Japanese performers like Sada Yako, and Chinese opera stars like Mei Lanfang, Qi Rushan, and others in China. Here we can see Loie in all of her splendor. Professor Eckel, David Eckel, here in our Department of Religion, put together a fascinating exhibition focusing on the 1893 Parliament of World Religions. That was one of the several parliaments that were held in conjunction with the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago. This was the first major exposure of Americans to Asian religions, and it's a really fascinating parliament. The organizers of the parliament were key Christian leaders, and although it wasn't the stated goal, the unstated goal was to demonstrate to the world the superiority of Christianity over other world religions. And they invited a variety of Asian representatives to provide talks and take part in discussions at the Congress in Chicago. These include a large delegation of Japanese practitioners and scholars, including Shaku Soin, this Zen master that we see here. It included, they felt that Confucianism was an Asian religion, and so they invited Peng Guangyu, who was the second secretary in the Chinese legation in Washington, D.C., to tell the assembled audience about Confucianism and various aspects of that. Peng and other participants were very thankful for the harmony and the gracious atmosphere. They applauded the efforts at brotherhood and international cooperation and collaboration on all fronts, but he's also a very savvy diplomat. And at this time in American history, he is dealing with terrible anti-Chinese riots that are going on, especially in the American West. And he and others didn't hold back in their criticisms of these kinds of shortcomings in American society. So it's a really interesting platform taking place at these World's Fairs of international feel-good harmony, and also getting some important diplomatic points out. The real rock star of the Parliament of World Religions, though, was Swami Vivekananda, who was speaking on behalf of India and Hinduism. He was an unexpected rock star from the moment he gave his very famous Sisters and Brothers of America speech, copies of which you can find easily online. His exotic outfit, he made a point of wearing exceptionally colorful turbans and robes, which the newspapers just couldn't write enough about, leads to a very important series of speaking tours, both in small towns in Illinois and Michigan and New York, but also he stayed in the United States for several years after the expo, finding more and more people interested in Hinduism and Asian religions in general. In fact, you can see the important impact of these performances like that by Swami Vivekananda. If you just walk a block down Bay State Road right here, you will see the Ramakrishna Vedanta Society, which was one of a number of institutions that were set up in the wake of the 1893 Parliament to provide centers for the study and practice of these religions that came onto the scene in 1893. Our recent PhD, Zhu Changguang, in History Department, came with the idea of putting together an exhibition for this project that focused on the Chinese Fisheries exhibit, which is part of the International Fisheries Exposition that was held in London in 1883. When this was first introduced, I thought, oh God, it sounds like a snoozer. Who wants to read about a fish expedition? But very quickly, I could recognize how wrong I was. Zhu Changguang put together a really fascinating and very intricate story about how fisheries were presented to the West as a way of engaging the West during these waning years of the Qing dynasty in both maritime rights, treaty port rights, naval architecture and navigation, and the commerce of materials from the sea. It's a really fascinating exhibit that involves the British royal family. It involves all sorts of really unexpected twists and turns. And this is being followed also by a similar exhibition in our project by Professor Ronald Poe at London School of Economics, who is similarly looking at the Chinese fisheries exposition at the really interesting 1906 International Fair in Milan. Ron also gets into the details of how the fisheries layer is really just an excuse for getting into deep diplomatic discussions with other world powers. Working with Ron, we uncovered a lot of really fun archival materials of early photographs and a fantastic Italian magazine that was dedicated to the Milan Fair that actually provides long descriptions and discussions of the Chinese fisheries exhibit. I don't have any slides for another really fascinating exhibit put together by an architectural historian at Columbia, Li Mengchuan, who's putting together a show that focuses on the use of modernist architecture at the 1935 Taiwan Colonial Exposition. This was an exposition put on by the Japanese administrative government to celebrate 40 years of Japanese rule over Taiwan. And Li puts together the argument of the use of modernist architecture for those pavilions that highlight Japan's benefits to the Taiwanese people. So economic, education building, the mining building, the railroad building, etc. are all these beautiful Art Deco modernist buildings, in opposition to the displays of Taiwan's Aboriginal groups, which are housed in pavilions with very, you might call them, traditional Asian kind of architecture. That is backwards, local, and not modernized kind of architecture. It's a really cool study, and if you like Art Deco, that exhibit is just full of really fun intersections with Art Deco displays. We have an Indian graduate student from UC Irvine who's doing her PhD on the tradition of nautch dancers in South Asia. And she's exploring the presentation of nautch dancing at international expositions. The earliest that we found so far is 1838 in France, and looking at the role of these nautch dancers at these expositions through time. London 1851 and all through the 19th and into the early 20th century, and how that impacts the social position of the nautch dancers. In its early years, they're very much associated with prostitution, and later, probably through, in part, these exhibitions, their status rises as performers and as an art form. So it's a really interesting exploration of traditional Asian dancing. I'm working on an exhibition on the Chinese arts and crafts, especially bronzes, ceramics, and jades that were part of the 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. Professor Dickinson mentioned this was America's first formal international exhibition, and it was a chance for America to showcase its strengths the way Britain had in 1851 and all the other European countries had in intervening years. The American exhibition was showcasing primarily mineral wealth and agricultural wealth of the Americans. A number of private Chinese bankers and companies that produced furniture and things used this as a marketing stage to send over and display many of these objects for sale, furniture and bronzes and things. This was the first, as far as I can tell, the first appearance of large numbers and large scale of these Chinese materials on an American exhibit as part of an international show. This builds on 40 years of private China museums that had appeared in Philadelphia in the 1830s, Boston in the 1840s, and New York City in the 1850s. So it's really fun to see how this exhibition in 1876, I think, is directly connected to the explosion of interest in collecting Asian art and Chinese art specifically in the subsequent decades, with collectors like Freer and many other collectors. This is when the big American collections of Chinese art started to take shape. There are many others in the works. This exhibition is not yet open to the public. Those of you who have been following us know it's been a long time. We still are trying to solve some WordPress issues. I would love to find out if any of you have WordPress expertise or have worked with WordPress designers. We would really love to hear from you to get this project pushed over the finish line so we can finally open it to the public. But it's a really fun avenue, a really fun sort of format with which to look at developments in Asian Western relations and understandings through this lens of these international fairs. The fairs set a high bar. If you look at newspaper accounts of these fairs, it's not uncommon to find headlines like this one from a Chicago newspaper in 1893. This is a gathering without parallel in the history of the world. Well, that's a pretty high mark to me, but I hope that we can continue to appreciate how important this particular vehicle was for cultural exchange and learning about other cultures, and the use of this platform for diplomatic and business and economic purposes. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to field questions later.
Thank you very much, Bob. You'll hear more about this in our third panel for speaking fellows. We're just going to take a couple minutes before we start the keynote. We're going to get an update on the slides set up, just very fresh for us. And that will be back.
I'll speak into the mic, but I may also try to project to the extent that I can. So I think Professor Dickinson is a professor of Japanese history at the University of Pennsylvania. He is his alma mater. He got a PhD at Yale University and also studied before that at Kyoto University, as well as the University of Notre Dame. His fields are history and diplomatic history and history of Japan. He has published numerous works. I will just mention some of his most important works, including War and National Reinvention, Japan and the Great War, 1914 to 1919, Taisho Tenno, the Japanese imperial system during the Taisho period, from Minerva Press in Japan, 2009, and his most recent major work is World War I and the Triumph of the New Japan, 1919 to 1930, which came out of the Cambridge University Press. He is an expert very much in the general time period. He said that he said this is a little bit too early for him, a decade earlier. We're asking him to operate a little bit outside of his comfort zone. I'm sure he's capable of doing it. He is originally, by the way, from Tokyo. He was born, I believe, in Tokyo and in Kanazawa. So I guess we'd call him Edoko. And has spent many years in Japan. He has also been a guest before here at Boston University. You might call him a repeat offender, but I've been delighted to have him up here. He's here for a reason. We've called upon him in the past for his expert and highly informed commentary. So I'll turn the floor over. And we were supposed to have another commentator, Richard Weitz, and unfortunately wasn't able to join us. So I'm going to afterwards try to do my best to give a few sort of brief impressionistic responses, and then we'll open up the floor for discussion. I'll serve as the moderator. So Fred, please come on.
I'd love to be an offender anytime, because BU is one of my favorite places. My son, as Thomas knows, went to BU, and coming up, what is it? We're April, I guess. Normally we would come up for the October, Parents' Weekend. So this is a nice change to come up when the cherry blossoms are blooming and still a little cold, but delighted to be here. Thank you so much, Thomas, and the Center for Asian Studies, the International History Institute, Pardee School, and especially Grant Road for doing all the logistics and inviting me here. And it's really a great pleasure to be here. I feel a little self-conscious because my images are not quite as good as what you just saw from Professor Mirochik, and they're not quite as good as Alice's are going to be, but I'll try my best. And one other sort of disclaimer, yes, I am a World War I specialist, not a Russo-Japanese war specialist. And so compared to the very nice sort of granular discussions we had from our speakers earlier today, I'm going to try to give sort of an overview, but we'll see how it goes. Looking forward to the discussion. Anyway, so let's get right to it. I just want to first, basically everything I say these days is all about this, which is my upcoming book on what I'm calling a global history of modern Japan, due out with Cambridge sometime later this year. I'm not sure if I use this image in my book, but this image is one of my favorite images from early 20th century Japan. because it sort of depicts a fabricated moment. This is the First World War. It's not Russo-Japanese War. We'll get there in a second. But the man in the middle is the Taisho Emperor at the time, and of course you can see French President Poincaré and to his right, and King George V to his right, and then you've got Nicholas, the Tsar, to his right. The idea being that this is a First World War in which Japan is central, a central player. And you laugh, but it is true, and you need to, okay, I'll promote my earlier book about the World War I and the triumph of New Japan. If you think it is a fabricated image, but you would not believe the sort of centrality of the Japanese experience until you read my book. And so, okay, enough of that. But the reason why I'm mentioning this here, aside from a self-promotion, is simply to say that the point of this book, which is just a synthetic text, and in some ways it's sort of, why should we be writing synthetic texts in a global age that are just focused on one state? I mean, it's a kind of a big question. Hard to answer, but my answer is essentially that one can, especially if I'm looking from the perspective of Japan, the point is to look at the world from a slightly different prism. In other words, I conceive of this project as not simply a history of modern Japan, but a history of the modern world. And the idea is that you can see a lot of different things about the world, whether it be the First World War or the Russo-Japanese War, if you actually look at it from the perspective of Japan. So that's what I'm sort of going to try to do today in my overview of the Russo-Japanese War. And I just want to begin with what I see to be some of the sort of interesting recent visions of the Russo-Japanese War. There are all kinds of things, and again, I'm not an expert, but things that sort of just jump out at me are things like Edmund Morris's 2002 book, Theodore Rex, which essentially was making the argument about how the Russo-Japanese War is a pivotal moment for the power of Teddy Roosevelt. And we already sort of talked about that earlier today. So it's increasingly a common idea, and it certainly makes a lot of sense. Another idea, and I was very privileged to be part of this project done by John Steinberg. We produced a two-volume work on the Russo-Japanese War with the subtitle of World War Zero. So the idea was the Russo-Japanese War was essentially a precursor. I mean, it was the beginning of total war. It was not the First World War, but the Russo-Japanese War was. So that was sort of the essentially overarching view. And I think that's becoming increasingly common in our look at the Russo-Japanese War. And finally, in my own field of Japan, a lot of it has been done about the Russo-Japanese War. One of the most recent ones by Frank Jacob in 2017 was basically, I mean, this seems fairly straightforward, but the idea that Japan is a regional power, but a regional power with fairly significant global reach. The idea that the Russo-Japanese War and Japan's victory in the war was sort of the foundation of all kinds of new ideas or issues of race or new ideas of empire. We've talked about some of these already. I think are very well articulated in this version of our understanding of the Russo-Japanese War. And I think, so, all of these are out there and very legitimate, and I think interesting. They do echo as well fairly familiar ideas of what we think the 20th century is. So, for instance, you're all familiar, no doubt, with Henry Luce, the publisher of Time Life magazine, born raised in China, came out with this seminal article just on the cusp of America's entry into the Second World War, talking about the so-called American century, and he was actually projecting. He was saying that America was doing good things from the 18th and 19th century onward, but he was saying, well, this is the moment to come of age. Let's be a global power, essentially. And so he coins the term American century, and then ultimately historians look back at all of the 20th century to think of it as an American century. And, there's some reason to do so, as we've heard, yes, from the Spanish-American War or even maybe earlier, the U.S. is really coming of its own and becoming a significant global player, and certainly giving truth to this idea of an American century. And I think so. The first, the Edmund Morris idea of Roosevelt, coming of age as a global sort of president, very much fits and supports this notion of American century. Another idea of the 20th century, this goes a little bit farther back, French philosopher Ramon Aron, in 1938, wrote a book, A Philosophy of History, essentially, in which he was making the very significant and real and very genuinely felt notion that we're now, after the First World War, in an age of total war, because of, obviously he lived through destruction. He didn't quite see, he's not looking at the Second World War yet, but I mean, it's fairly, it's a good prediction, and certainly a very legitimate notion that we are in the 20th century, in particular, an age of total war. And that sort of goes along, again, very well with this sort of John Steinberg's edited volumes, that the Russo-Japanese War is also a sort of reflection of this familiar idea of 20th century as a total war. And finally, one of my own mentors at Yale University, Paul Kennedy, while I was there, he was publishing this book, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. It's really mostly, it's a very longue durée history going back to the 18th and 19th centuries, but essentially talking about a 20th century is really a global century in terms of the networks that are formed, in terms of empire, etc. And I think clearly the Frank Jacob book about Japan as a regional power is very much sort of bringing that kind of idea to life as well. So again, all three of these sort of Russo-Japanese War focused, fairly recent books very nicely articulated this familiar notions of the 20th century, but in many ways, if you're dealing with the Russo-Japanese War, you're pushing the chronology back, and that's a very good and very laudable sort of contribution. So, right, normally when Henry Luce was talking about American century, again, he's talking about from mid-century on. But if we're talking about an American century or a U.S. global presence through the prism of the Russo-Japanese War, you're pushing the chronology back. If you're talking about the age of total wars not being the First World War, but actually beginning with the Russo-Japanese War, then again, you're pushing the chronology back in a way that is very significant. And also, in terms of, Paul Kennedy essentially is talking about networks, mostly post-Second World War. But, of course, if you make that story begin with the Russo-Japanese War, then again, the chronology is moving way back, and you get a whole new idea of quite interesting power dynamics and networks going on. And I think that's one of the main sort of contributions of some of these newer works on the Russo-Japanese War. So let's move on to talk about then, okay, so again, I do appreciate, clearly we've moved very far beyond the sort of original analyses of the Russo-Japanese War immediately after the conflict, in which it was very much written by participants and sort of discussion of strategic and tactical issues. And much of the scholarship these days is very much more global, much more comprehensive, and very valuable. But I would say that we are 120 years out, and so we can maybe push the envelope a little more. And so what I want to do is to sort of give you a sense of how we might move the discussion of the Russo-Japanese War even further, to open up our sort of horizons even more than what these great works more recently of the Russo-Japanese War have done. And it seems to me that it's fairly, I wouldn't say simple, but using Japan or Russia to do this, and from a Russian or Japanese perspective, can be very efficacious, because for the most part, when we're looking at almost anything in the 20th century, we're looking at it from the perspective of the United States or Britain or France or whatever. So the moment you sort of move beyond that sort of Western-centric history, you have this great sort of opportunity to think about something in a slightly different prism. And so that's the whole point of, again, my text on modern Japan, but also my vision of the Russo-Japanese War today is, so how might we sort of, let's instead of just sort of confirming our familiar sort of ideas of what the 20th century is, let's think about the Russo-Japanese War in a way that maybe challenges or pushes us beyond that to think of a little bit slightly different story. And so that's what I'm going to try to do. I'm going to fly the Japanese flag and try to signal something else. So let's see what happens. Okay, 3 things. Again, from the perspective of Japan and Russo-Japanese War, one of the great or important events to begin with is the Anglo-Japanese alliance. The first, most of the points I'm going to just be making here, by the way, will be very familiar with you. So it's not that the facts that I'm giving you are new facts, but I'm just sort of trying to show you how if we focus or emphasize certain things over others, then it invites us to think slightly differently about the early 20th century. So the fact here that, again, you probably are very familiar with is the idea that the Anglo-Japanese alliance is the first formal alliance that the British are tying, essentially, in many, many, many decades. It is followed by the Entente Cordiale, it's followed by the Anglo-Russian Entente, it's followed by the Triple Entente, and these alliances are typically sort of described as part of the process of moving into a sort of a network of alliances that become binding, that sort of suck the great powers into the First World War. So they're, it's not like I'm the first one to talk about them. And it's not like I'm the first one to sort of make the point that this, it is the end of British splendid isolation. All I want to do here is just to sort of emphasize this point for a moment. The most important thing, it seems to me, in terms of thinking differently about the Russo-Japanese War, is to think about the backdrop to that, the Anglo-Japanese alliance, as the end of British splendid isolation and the beginning of a fairly robust network of alliance building. So I'm going to leave that, I'll tell you what it all means in a minute, but I just want to throw that out there first. Number 2, so in terms of thinking about the war itself, again, this is fairly familiar territory. We all know that Japan is gaining many things from this particular war. One could say many things, but let me just put out a couple. Clearly the Japanese are already an empire. The Sino-Japanese War happens between 1894 and 95. They move into Taiwan, the Pescadore Islands. Here with the Russo-Japanese War, you are for the first time a continental empire, and some historians would emphasize that as, okay, here's the beginning of the great continental Japanese empire, which carries us to Manchuria, and then the Japanese troops breaking beyond the Great Wall of China, and ultimately sort of invading almost the entire continent, or at least the coastal part of the entire continent. In other words, it becomes a fairly familiar backdrop to our understanding of what's happening in the Asia-Pacific War, that we might call it. And so, yes, certainly very worthy of emphasis. I will say, though, from my perspective, more important than this, because Japan is already an empire, I would like to emphasize this idea. The idea that it's really the point of the Russo-Japanese War that Japan is able to escape fully the stigma of the so-called unequal treaties upon which she had, with which she had struggled since the 1860s. As you may know, the story of Japan, it's like China, it's like Korea, essentially initial victims of great power Western imperialism. Part of that victimization is unequal treaties whereby you don't have the power to decide your own tariffs. You don't have the power to try foreign nationals in your own courts. And so these sort of legal mechanisms finally go by the wayside fully for Japan by 1911, and all of Japan's sort of diplomatic representatives across the world, they get a promotion to actually consuls and to full ambassadors. Before this time, the Japanese are still sort of second-rate citizens on the international stage. So it's really at the point of the Russo-Japanese War that you get this. And I think this really is the most, is more important than the empire issue, because it will sort of, again, plug into it plugs into a point that we just made earlier about a new, more global, networked world. But we're looking at it from a slightly different perspective here of Japan and the consequences of the Russo-Japanese War. Okay, a third point in terms of what is interesting about this war from the perspective of Japan is something I sort of mentioned in my questioning earlier today. But, and this is a part that we should not sort of lose sight of it. We all know it, but it's important because of some of the implications. And just, keep in mind, as we said before, this is not a slam dunk for Japan by any means. And particularly, the ground war is a disaster. But it's not just the ground war. I mean, the naval war doesn't begin very well either. From the beginning, Togo's initial surprise, as I note here, attack leaves 5 of 7 Russian battleships intact, in fact, and incapacitates 4 of Japan's 6 first battleships. That's just one small example, but you could go through a list of things, of really bad sort of tactical things that happen that, had they gone, had the Russians been able to take advantage of it, we'd be living in a very different world. Another small example of what's happening, Japan suffering more casualties, using more ammunition in the Battle of Nanshan in May of 1904 in Manchuria than the entire Sino-Japanese War. Okay, I mean, you can imagine the sort of the burden of that cost. General Nogi, the main Japanese general in charge, conquers the 203-meter hill at Port Arthur, as shown here, but only on his 4th attempt in November 1904, and at the cost of 64,000 Japanese casualties. More than triple Russian losses. And one of his sons was lost here. His other son was lost in Nanshan. It's a complete and utter disaster. I mean, Nogi himself, as you may know, wanted to commit suicide after all this terrible, and was prevented from doing so by the emperor. There are those military losses. There are the financial losses that you can just imagine. Essentially, the war ballooned Japan's national debt by 4 times. Going from 600 million to 2.4 billion yen, and this is depicted in all kinds of media at the time. Japanese citizens are living under the burden of just growing taxes, all the way up through the First World War. It's only the point of the First World War when Japan finally sort of gets out of the sort of economic hole and can get back to business again. And just finally, and this is the most important point, and this really goes to my own particular expertise. I'm a political historian, really, at heart. And the Hibiya riots were mentioned earlier because as a reaction to Japan not being able to get all of Sakhalin, and as a reaction to Japan not being able to get any kind of indemnity. And this is there's 17 lives lost in Tokyo, hundreds or millions of dollars of damage here, and in the history of modern Japan, it goes down in history as the first big mass riot of the 20th century we have to contend with when we're talking about this Russo-Japanese War. And for me, the most important sort of aftermath of this is the fall of the Katsura cabinet. Now, the Gendo were described before. Essentially, Japanese politics from 1868 up through the Russo-Japanese War are, the politics of oligarchy. And it continues on a while, but this is really the first time in which an oligarchic cabinet really is forced to sort of resign because of a mass popular sort of outpouring of distaste and disgust by the outcome of the Russo-Japanese War. So okay, so what does this all mean? Essentially, let's then re-emphasize the point. The idea that Britain is tying its star with Japan in 1902 has serious global geopolitical implications. And one of them, and the idea that the Japanese are defeating a Western power, as was already mentioned before, has serious global geopolitical implications. Often this is the kind of story that we hear, and this is very real, and we heard some of it before. Sun Yat-sen, Pham Boi Chau in Vietnam, Sun Yat-sen in China, Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, Korean patriot An Jung-geun. Across the board, you have very significant outpouring of enthusiasm for the destruction of a Western empire by the Japanese. And just to quote An Jung-geun, Japan's victory was glorious. It meant that the vanguard of the white race, which had done a great evil for hundreds of years, was crushed. And I don't know if you actually know who An Jung-geun is. Yes, if you do, it's kind of ironic because An Jung-geun is essentially worshipping Japan, and then he goes and kills Ito Hiromune, which becomes the spark to the sort of colonization of Korea. And he kills Ito because clearly the Japanese rise to power wasn't exactly what he thought it was going to be. It wasn't just a destruction of Western power. It was more simply the rise of Japanese power. At any rate, it's true that this story of enthusiasm for down with the Europeans or down with Western hegemony is a new phenomenon. It's a powerful phenomenon. Pan-Asianism comes of age. I will say that from my perspective, that's a slightly overplayed, and for my money, I think the more important point here is going back to the issue of the Anglo-Japanese alliance, and that is that this sort of end, or the Japanese sort of destruction of Russia by virtue of its tie with the British, essentially is showing the reliance of the so-called empire upon which the sun never sets, the absolute reliance of that power on Japan. It's certainly giving us a good vision of Asian admiration for Japan, but even more important is the idea that what we thought was a European age of the 19th century, a European age that we think maybe is replaced by the Americans with the First World War, well, it's already seeing fairly significant challenges going back to the Russo-Japanese War, and that challenge is embodied by the Anglo-Japanese alliance, which is essentially a sign of British weakness. So that's a slightly different way of looking then at, or a slightly different way of challenging the idea of American century, right? Second, I will say again that, as we said, Japan is really coming of age in a way after the Russo-Japanese War. And it's not only sort of being accepted then sort of legally on the international stage at this time, but it really becomes a preview of Japanese centrality in global politics. Now, I would absolutely agree with Frank Jacob when he says that Japan is not a global power with the Russo-Japanese War; it's just a regional power. But it is also true that victory pleases in many ways Britain, obviously its ally, and others in the Western European world, ironically at the same time that is sort of inspiring An Jung-geun. And it does so in a way that by the time we come to 1914, and bad things begin to happen in Europe, that there is an idea in every Western capital on the verge of plunging into destruction in August of 1914. They're wondering how they can get the Japanese to come and help with the project. This is not just the British, it's not just the French, it's also the Germans and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Everyone is bending over backward, jumping over themselves, trying to make sure that they can secure the Japanese participation in this fight. And in fact, this again, it's sort of outside of our interest here with the Russo-Japanese War today, but this is something that I write about elsewhere, is the degree to which Japan is very much central to an Allied victory in 1918. And it's not simply a matter of transporting imperial troops from Australia to the Indian Ocean, but it's also a matter of putting real concrete ships in harm's way in the Mediterranean to hunt out German U-boats. It's actually sending the Russians ammunition and arms. It's sending the French destroyers. It's sending Japanese ship bottoms to help transport coal between France and Britain, and to help transport grain between Australia and Europe. So again, it's slightly out of our sort of immediate focus for today, but the point being that Japan only sort of adopts this role, or is only given this role, by virtue of its impressive it was a mixed victory, but it was a victory nonetheless, and Japan is on the map by 1905 as a player that can be definitely global. By the way, I really love this particular cartoon from the Japanese press that shows from the Japanese perspective that they are, again, all of a sudden central to an Allied fight during the First World War. You have the French ladies or the European ladies just all over the Japanese soldier, wanting the Japanese soldier to get involved. So that's sort of embodiment of that. So finally, and this is a part that it might sort of confuse you a little, because this is not the usual narrative we hear about Japan, but one of the reasons why we need to emphasize the Hibiya riots, the downside of the Russo-Japanese War for Japan, is because that forms the foundation of very new developments in early 20th century Japan, particularly political developments. And those are developments that I said earlier emerge out of the destruction of the oligarchic Katsuda cabinet, and that becomes a foundation for consistent Japanese political party cabinets from 1918 to 1932, and those in turn become a foundation for Japan's central role in the participation of building a new liberal internationalist world after the First World War. We typically don't think of or associate Japan with the League of Nations or with the Washington Conference or the Kellogg-Briand Pact or the London Conference, but Japan is very much alive and well and performing and central to that project, in many ways more central than the United States, which is not even a member of the League of Nations. And this is, again, reflected by, and it's only a reflection of a dramatic sort of political change within Japan that is forecast by the Russo-Japanese War. And those are some of the, another of my favorite political cartoons. Again, this is the First World War, and as soon as I'm done with this, we'll dispense with the First World War. But here you see on the right, this is the Japanese sort of statesman helping to shape a new world, a Shinsekai, with the other Allied powers in 1919. So again, from the Japanese perspective, very central. And that centrality, again, could only happen first with the rise to power with the Russo-Japanese War. Okay, so let me just try to wrap up to give you a sense of what I was trying to say, if I didn't actually say it. The point being, Russo-Japanese War, from the perspective of Japan, I think offers us some very interesting way of getting slightly beyond the usual story of 20th century as an American century, or 20th century as a total war century, or 20th century as a global century, and to give us a variation of the theme, but a variation that I think is fairly significant. And just to reiterate what I think that rethinking is, it really sort of allows us. Here we go. Let me just change here. So we go from the American century here, right? Robert Crumb, to here's Japanese delegates at the League of Nations. Okay, so for instance, I already mentioned Brooks Adams earlier, but again, I think it sort of, if you do pay attention to what is really going on in 1905 from a Japanese perspective, it gives you a tip-off that, okay, I mean, we're not denying that America is rising as a global power at the same time. But as I said earlier in one of my questions, by the latter 19th century, Asia is really the area of the world in which sort of the Western powers are very excited to have a piece of, to show off their might, and that's exactly what Teddy Roosevelt is doing. It's exactly what the British are doing, and essentially by seeing the performance of Japan in 1905, we get a sense of how thinking of American century may be, at least we should modify that to say that the global foundation for American century would be one way of putting it, I suppose. In other words, you can't have an American century without the dynamism of an Asia and the Russo-Japanese War essentially sort of shows or is the opportunity for Japan to sort of reflect and to promote and to champion that dynamism. In terms of total war, yes, indeed, we're not denying that we're in a new era of mass communication, mass slaughter, mass everything. It's an age of total war. But we have to sort of keep in mind, and looking at the Japanese performance in the Russo-Japanese War and after helps us keep in mind the contingencies in history to understand that this is a mixed victory. It's not a slam dunk victory. It brings fairly significant political turmoil in Japan. That significant political turmoil is a foundation for alternative trajectories. Japan is very much getting on that alternative trajectory in the 1920s, at least, to help build a new global peace infrastructure. Obviously, that goes terribly awry in the 1930s. And if you want to know how that happens, well, read my third book. I'd be happy to talk about it later at Q&A if you like. But in other words, looking at the Russo-Japanese War in Japan is a way of getting away from simply the idea that 20th century is just a century of total war. And finally, this is something we already just said. Paul Kennedy, of course, was right about everything, and I wish I could have been or could be Paul Kennedy. I can't be Paul Kennedy, but one thing that he would not necessarily say is that we are in an Asia-Pacific century or Asia-Pacific world already by 1905, but essentially that's the claim I'm making, is that Teddy Roosevelt is coming of age only by virtue of the fact that there is a war between Japan and Russia in Asia. It's an area in which the Americans have already laid claim and want to continue to lay claim, and that's really the source of American power. And so for me, that is a fairly, if you want to talk about any kind of straight line trajectory, it's one of Asia as the center of gravity of world geopolitics from the 1905 all the way to the present. Okay, I guess I'll leave it at that. And Thomas, if you have any questions or comments, thank you very much.
Well, after such a polished and knowledgeable exposition of thoughts and reflections on the Russo-Japanese War, I'm very hesitant to say anything. I can't help it, and I'm freestyling, no hands here. I saw some of Fred's, I know Fred's work from before, so some of the themes are familiar to me, and I saw his slides, but I'm trying to respond broadly. I'm going to simply say I'm a consumer. I'm a political scientist. I'm an international relations scholar. I'm an avid consumer of the research and the knowledge which real scholars and historians produce. There are many lessons, from a practical point of view, that one would want to draw. I was unfortunately not here this morning. I don't know if people touched on it, but for example, the role of intelligence. Since John Woodward is one of our co-sponsors and is an expert on intelligence, intelligence played a critical role in this war. And that one of the key benefits for the Japanese of the Anglo-Japanese alliance was the fact that the British were able to keep track of the Russian fleet as it came across the Russian Baltic fleet, coming all across through British territory, and the British are keeping track every step of the way and informing the Japanese when should you expect the Russian battleships to show up at the Straits of Tsushima, where Admiral Togo Heihachiro was waiting to sink them. The role of finance. The British-Japanese Empire almost became bankrupt, and was only thanks to the help of financiers in London who helped raise a war bond, which kept the Japanese war effort afloat. Incidentally, many of those financiers were Jewish, and were responding to the vicious anti-Jewish pogroms which were then taking place in the Russian Empire. And then, in what the Japanese would call Okaishi, and again we have some people who are experts like Professor Hillel Levine, the Japanese during the Second World War helped shield Jewish refugees who came to the Shanghai. So there are interesting chains again, and lessons to be learned about the role of finance. One which is perhaps even more relevant is the question of resilience. War is not simply a matter of physical capabilities, material capabilities, so certainly the Japanese and the Russians demonstrated a lot of that, but also the will to continue to fight. We are very much reminded of this, and I'm going to come back to the contemporary lessons, we have a whole discussion about the Russian war, and the Russian resilience is the term of art now in Washington, D.C. The Russians have a well-proven capability of soldiering on despite enormous losses. And we see this again in the Ukraine, and this is one of the lessons that we're drawing from the Ukraine war. However, here in the Russo-Japanese war, we saw the limits of Russian resilience. The Russians do sometimes carry on with extraordinary fortitude, as they did against Napoleon, right, in the Napoleonic Wars and in 1812, as they did again in the Second World War. But there are also times when the Russians crack, and very much so. The Russo-Japanese War was the one at which, at the end, both sides were almost destroyed, almost exhausted, at the outer edges of their strength. So the Russians, by the way, had considerable, as I understand it, and again, I don't know if we had discussions of it this morning or perhaps later on, but militarily the Russians had considerable reserves, but their political will to continue to fight was breaking apart. Now the third point, the last point which I'm going to say, which is perhaps, now here I'm going to be a little heretical, perhaps controversial, but as we say, this is the beginning of the American century, Henry Luce's famous article. Teddy Roosevelt, our president at the time, very much a realist president, that is one who appreciated the role of power, who believed that the time had arrived for the United States to live up to its responsibilities in world politics, to move beyond the tradition of what's called American isolationism from George Washington's address on, wanted the United States to play a larger role. And he was expanding America's power rather aggressively in places like, random places like Panama. And he also saw this as an opportunity for the United States to play a new role on the world stage and help negotiate, not far from here. I mean, you can visit the hotel. There's also a nice exhibition at Portsmouth right? And here the United States was arriving on the world stage. Well, at this moment, the United States is once again trying to resolve and negotiate an end of another conflict involving Russia in the Ukraine. And we have another American president who has some expansive notions about the world role. And we're trying to usher in a new order. When we go back and we take a look at the order that was being renegotiated, and I guess as an IR scholar that's what's interesting, was at least at first it seemed to be one that was presented as an extension. There had been a change in the balance of power, a change in the correlation of forces, if you like, to use the Soviet term, between Japan and Russia. There was developing, and it was time to restructure it. The imperial order, however, that was dominant in Asia was now being renegotiated. And that was one which, by the way, was being supported by many of the Western powers. This would set into motion the consolidation of Japanese control over the Korean Peninsula. This would lead to negotiations, including between the United States and Japan, the Taft-Katsura Agreement, and there were a series of agreements where the United States would recognize Japan's interest in Korea, and Japan in turn would recognize our interest in the Philippines. And so and for a while, and exactly what Fred's work, which he expertly described, Japan was in many ways was becoming a pillar of the imperial order. And yet one of the things which, when again we take a look at the lessons that we might possibly draw from the history of the Russo-Japanese War, the new order already contained within it tension, which would begin to unravel the system. In the case of Japan, a number of I studied Japanese defense policy, and quite a few of the Japanese defense intellectuals who I used to speak to were very fascinated by this history. They see this moment between roughly 1902 until sometime in the 1920s as the moment where Japan really was kind of a pillar of the international order. But already, as Fred quite correctly points out, you could begin to see internally inside of Japan forces which were challenging it. The Hibiya riots were and it was not just riots in Hibiya, but there were also voices inside the Japanese military itself who were not willing to stop. They wanted to seize more than what they were being given at the Treaty of Portsmouth. And at that moment in time, you still had the old Genro, including Yamagata Aritomo, who had been the founder of the Japanese army, one of the chief leaders. He and Ito Hirobumi are arguably the two most important late Genro, but Fred will correct me. And he basically went to those young officers who were agitating for continuing the war. And he said, shut up, right? Stand down. Yeah. This is not in Japan's national interest. He understood that Japan was reaching the limits of its strength, that if it went further, it might not be able to sustain the effort, and it would begin to turn more of the international community against it. And the young officers, because of the stature of Yamagata, stepped down. One of the great tragedies, which Fred discusses in his works, was the Japanese political system was no longer able to contain both the institutions of the army and the military, but more importantly, the forces of nationalism, which were being unleashed in this moment. A kind of national hubris, sense of overweening pride, was beginning to emerge in Japan. And this would help ultimately lead. Well, it didn't have to. There were alternative trajectories that could have been followed. But it would help lead the seeds to Japanese militarism over expansionism and the ultimate destruction of that imperial order, which seemed to be being reaffirmed and modernized in 1904, 1905. Inside of Russia, again, the Russian imperial, why the Russians stopped was not simply because they were reaching the limits of their, actually the Russian forces were beginning to deploy more experienced units from Western Europe through the Trans-Pacific Railroad to Siberia. They could have possibly begun to wear down the Japanese, but already you began to see revolts inside of the Russian system. This is the most famous cinematic depiction of that is Sergei Eisenstein's famous battleship of Potemkin, where revolutionary sailors were beginning to rebel against their officers. This was actually going to be one of the inspirations. That's why Eisenstein made his film for the Russian Revolution. So it was setting in motion inside of Russia forces which would eventually lead to a complete collapse inside of the Russian system and the Bolshevik Revolution. And then finally, I think the other interesting thing is exactly as Fred pointed out, and today again, parallels are hard to avoid, right? I mean, they're talking about the rise of the global South. Well, in some ways, we saw the rise of a global East. We saw the rise of, there was the inspiration of nationalism throughout Asia. I remember I used to work in Tokyo Library, the Tokyo University Library, and there's a portrait of Rabindranath Tagore that used to hang there. There used to be a poem of his which celebrated, right? It was in Bengali and in English, I guess in Japanese translation, but celebrating the victory. Well, Tagore himself actually at first was very positive about the victory of the Japanese, the triumph of the East over the West. But as he went on and he studied, he looked at this and he was in close contact with figures from Japan. If you visit his museum in Calcutta, actually there's extensive collections of various people, including Russians, who visited him. He was disturbed by the kinds of emotions and sentiments. It was the rise of an Asian nationalism, including in China, in Korea, which increasingly in the coming years would clash with the Japanese Empire. And was that clash between Japanese and Korean and Chinese nationalism, which would ultimately lead to the disintegration, to the Second World War, the disintegration of that order. So what I'm trying to say is, as we try to create a new order, if that's what we're doing, and sometimes I can't help but think that we're watching Captain Chaos in action, we should be aware of how unexpected ways the seeds of the destruction of that order are already being laid. So that's one of the major lessons that I would draw. Those are my quick impressionistic responses. I think we'll open up the floor, and Fred, and I'll moderate. Fred, you can recognize the interlocutors.
Okay, yeah, thank you. If I may just say thank you, Thomas. That was very, very, very nice of you, and a good summation. One thing I would say, if we are thinking about Russo-Japanese War in the context of today, my take on Russo-Japanese War and Ukrainian War and the parallel is slightly different. If we're going to accept my premise that American century is not the American century you thought it was, it's an American century where one leg is Japan, the implication is the Ukrainian War is not something that America can control. That seems to be saying just the obvious, I guess. But again, if you're simply thinking about 20th century as an America century, and you're thinking about TR is coming and rising to the global stage, and I would love to give him credit, but he can only do what he's doing by virtue of the Russians and the Japanese cooperating, obviously. And again, if you tie that into the sort of discussion of Anglo-Japanese alliance and what that really means, it means a Eurocentric world, as far as I can see, is not a thing already in 1900, and certainly by 1905. By virtue of the fact that the most destructive war in history in 1905 is the Russo-Japanese War in Asia, and the two principal actors are certainly non-Western European powers. That to me sort of demonstrates one of the most important ideas of the Russo-Japanese War, and that is, well, if you thought we were living in a Eurocentric world for a while, well, maybe we were, but we certainly haven't been doing that for going back to 1900. And when we're thinking about Ukraine, we shouldn't, Mr. Trump shouldn't think of himself as TR, and that he can actually come out with a similar consequence. Anyway, that's kind of long-winded. I would love to hear more questions from the